So we're going to get started on our Kette Cowl, and I've just started to cast on. And this is the yarn I'm using for my main collar. This is Knit Picks' Swish DK in Dove Heather colorway. It's a 100% superwash merino wool. And I've already started casting on. I just have a few stitches left to cast on. So I'm just using a long tail cast on method. You can use whichever cast on method you prefer. Okay, so now I've cast on all my stitches. So all my stitches are cast on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to run in the round, and we want to make sure that nothing is twisted. We don't want our work to be twisted. So what we're going to do is I like to scoot as many stitches as I can on one needle, the needle I'm going to be working from. And just make sure that all these little cast on knots are inside the circle. Nothing is twisted. If anything looks like this, we want to just straighten it out and make sure everything is nice and in a line. Okay, so now we're going to join in the round, and then we'll need a stitch marker, and I just have a little clipping marker here. You can use a clipping marker or a ring marker, it doesn't matter. Just need to mark the beginning of our round. So what we're going to do, I'm going to put our stitch marker on our working needle, and all we're going to do, everything's nice and neat and straight, so we're just going to join in the round, and all that looks like is putting your needle into the first stitch that you cast on. Your working yarn's over here. Just going to insert and pick up our yarn. Make sure you don't knit with the tail. Mine's all tangled. There it is. We have our working yarn, we have our needle. All we do is wrap it around and knit. And that's all we're going to do for the first round. If you follow your pattern, the first round is knitting all stitches. And then the second round and all the rounds after that, for the bottom rib, we'll be ribbing the bottom hem. The first round is all knitting, and I like knitting the first round of projects in the round because I feel like it's easier. The first round's always the tightest, but I also feel like it gives a nice prominent cast on edge. You see on my sample here, this is my cast on, and I think it just makes the long tail cast on, or any cast on, just more of a feature, I feel like. So I'm just going to knit all the way around, and then we'll jump into the ribbing. Okay, so I'm approaching the end of my first round, my knit round. So just have these few last stitches, and I split the stitch. Okay. There we go. And I can just pull my cast on tail a little bit to tighten up that stitch. Okay. So I'm at the end of my first round, and now the next round and every round after for the bottom hem, we are here in our cowl. We're going to be doing this hem portion before we get to the color work. It's going to be a 2x2 rib. So what that's going to look like is we're just going to slip our marker, slip this just marks the beginning of a round. And what we're going to do is we're going to knit 2, and then we're going to purl 2. So it's just knit 2, purl 2, all the way around until your bottom hem measures as the pattern calls for, or as long as you want it. It's the hem of the cowl. It can be as long or as short as you like. So that's all you're going to do, and then we'll be jumping into the color work portion. I have finished the bottom hem of my Kette Cowl, all the ribbing done, and I've followed my pattern and done one break round before starting the color work, so I'm all ready. I have my contrasting color. This yellow is what I'm going to be using for the patterning. So I have all that ready to go. And now we're going to take a look at the chart. And if you have your pattern, here's the chart. I've kind of folded the paper up so you can see it better. So here's the chart. Each square of this little chart is 1 stitch. And I have 6 little blocks here. This is the pattern repeat. This is the same. We'll be knitting these 6 stitches all around the cowl. And it is a 10-row repeat. So we'll be just repeating this chart for as many times as the pattern tells us. So each block is 1 stitch. And the white squares are the color we cast it on in. So in my case, it's this gray. And these black squares are our contrast color, our CC, which is what I'm using this yellow for. So all we do is just take it 1 stitch at a time and knit the pattern. So here's my work. So I've knit 1 stitch just to keep my stitch marker in place. And if I look over here, I know I need 3 colors knit in MC, the main color. So I already did 1. So I'm going to do, it's 2, and that's 3. And now I have 1 contrast color to knit. And my yarn is all tangled up. I haven't even started the color work yet. Okay. So I have my 3 main colors, and now I need to make 1 contrast color. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my contrasting color, and I'm going to go into the stitch and just insert it, wrap it around, and pull it through. And now I'm attached. Now I've got 2 colors. Just gonna get my tail out of the way. 2 colors going. And so I follow my pattern. I have to knit 2 main color stitches. So it's 1, 2. And now I've done 1 repeat, and now I have to go back to the beginning of the chart. So I need to knit 3 main colors. 1, 2, 3. And now I need to knit 1 contrast color. And all I do is pick it up and knit 1 contrast color. But I want you to see, the thing about color work is you don't want your floats to be too tight, and you don't want them to be too loose. It's kind of a game to figure out what's the right tension. So all I did was drop my main color, and I picked up my contrast, but I want to make sure before I knit it, I don't want my stitches to be all bunched up like this, because if they're all bunched up like this and I knit this stitch, then my float, which is the bars on the back of the work, that's going to be all tight. Look at that. It's going to be so tight, and I don't want that, because then my color work isn't going to lay flat. You won't be able to see the pattern. So I want to make sure before I knit this stitch, I want to make sure that I spread my stitches out, not too much, but just enough so that when my yarn is reaching to knit this stitch, nothing's getting bunched up. So you can see this float that's a good, reasonable float. And that's only my 2nd stitch, so my tail is still kind of being all loose. Okay, so now I need to knit 2 main color stitches, so I just drop this yarn, pick up my main color, and knit 2. And now I'm back at the beginning of the chart. Knit 3 main color, and knit 1 contrast color. Making sure that my stitches are nice and spread out, and I'm just reaching, I'm not yanking, I'm not pulling like that. I'm just spreading it out and just making it stretch just as much as it needs to. And now I need to knit 2 main colors, so I just drop that, and I knit with my main color. And that's all you do for this first round. And then for the next round, you'll do the same, just you'll follow your chart and make sure you do, the next round is you do 2 main colors, 1 contrast, 1 main, 1 contrast, 1 main. So you just want to follow your pattern and take it stitch by stitch. But something else we need to talk about with color work is color place, I suppose. In color work, you have 2 or more colors. In this case, we have 2. So we have our main color, which is the body of the cowl, and our contrast cowl color, which is going to be the patterning. And if you see me knitting, I'm knitting my pattern 1, 2, 3. I'm dropping my yarn and I'm picking up my yellow. Now, when I pick up my yellow, I don't just pick it up over top. I'm not picking it up like this. If you saw over here, I'm making sure when I pick up my color, my contrast color, that I am grabbing it underneath. That's just what I naturally do. I just grab it and make sure it's traveling underneath my gray yarn. You can make it, if you want to make it go over your main color, that's fine. The point is you be consistent with it, because in color work, the way your yarn travels over each other, it does affect the patterning overall. The colors will, the way they lay in the work, you'll notice if you're not consistent. If you are grabbing your yellow and placing it over your gray for one time, or if you're grabbing it from underneath another time, you'll notice in the completed cowl. So that's just something to be aware of. I kind of just make a mental note to myself to grab underneath, to grab my contrast color underneath my main color. It's just easier for me to remember if I do that all the time. But as long as you're consistent, it's okay. If you choose to go over your main color or to choose to go under your main color, as long as you're consistent, your patterning will be okay. Now I'm going to get to the end of this round, and then we're going to meet back and talk about the beginning of round. This little tip I want to share with you there. So this is a picture of our chart. You can see on the bottom we have numbers 1 through 6, and on the right going up we have numbers 1 through 10. Now each block on this chart represents 1 stitch. So this is a 6-stitch repeat that will be repeating across the cowl, and then it's 10 rounds for each repeat. And how we read our color work charts is that we always read our charts when working in the round. We start at the right end of the chart and we work to the left. So we'll be reading the charts from right to left. And that is how you will read your chart and repeat the pattern repeat all the way around. So on row 1, you start at the right of the chart. And then for row 2, you will just start reading from the right to the left again. And that is how you will read your chart throughout working your cowl. You'll always, when you're on a new round, you'll always be starting from right to left. Okay, so I'm now at the end of my first round. I have just 3 stitches left to knit. So I'm on a yellow stitch, so I'm going to pick it up, I'm going to wrap it, and I'm going to knit these last 2 stitches. 1, and here's my last stitch. And now, before I knit the stitch, according to pattern, this stitch is supposed to be a main color stitch. And that's what I'm gonna knit. But when knitting in the round, your work, it's not like when knitting flat where your work is row upon row, neatly stacked. Knitting in the round is actually a spiral effect. And if you've knit stripes in the round before, in a hat or something, you know that you'll get, like, when you change color, you get like a jog, a color jog. And this will be, you'll see this in your cowl too, because you'll have this patterning all around the cowl, and then when you get to the patterning, it's going to be here and going to be here. Your beginning of round, you'll get a bit of a jog. The way I use to avoid that, as best I can, it doesn't completely negate it, but the way I use to avoid that is when I knit this last stitch, I knit it 1 row above what it's supposed to be. So on this row, it doesn't really matter. This is my first row, but I'm on row 1 right here. So this last stitch should be a main color stitch, but I'm going to pretend that I'm on row 2 and I'm going to knit it how it's supposed to be knit above. Now in this case, it's going to be the same. It's going to be still main color stitch. But when I'm on row 2, what it's going to look like is I'm not going to make it a main color stitch. I'm going to knit it as a yellow stitch. I'm going to knit it, this last stitch, 1 stitch above what it's supposed to be, just the very last stitch of the round, to help make it not as prominent as the spiral, if that makes sense. I just find that that helps to hide the spiral effect. Here is my finished Kette Cowl, and once all is said and done and your work is blocked, even if you don't do this, you probably won't be able to find your beginning of round, to be honest. I'm pretty sure my beginning of round is here because I messed up a stitch here. But honestly, it's, unless you're really looking for it and like you're going to get a prize if you find it, you're not really going to notice. But this is what I recommend in the pattern just to help, because when you're knitting it, you notice it. But once it's blocked and everything, you don't notice it. So this is just what I do, what I recommend in the pattern. You can do it, you don't have to do it. Like I said, when it's all washed and blocked, you're not going to notice. But this is just what I recommend. So last stitch, only the last stitch of every row, just knit it 1 row above what it's supposed to be. So if I were on row 2, instead of making it a main color stitch, I would make it a contrast color stitch. And then when I'm on row 3, I would knit the very last stitch as if I were on row 4. That's just a little trick I use. And yeah, that's it. That's all I'm going to do. Just this very last stitch, the stitch before your beginning of round marker. That's the only stitch you're going to manipulate that way. Okay, so we're on row 2 of our pattern now. And row 2 of our pattern looks like this. We are going to knit 2, knit 1 in contrast, knit 1 plain, knit 1 in contrast, knit 1 in main. That's our pattern. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to talk once more about managing our yarns, because I think that's the hardest part of color work, is managing the colors. You've got 2 colors going on, and it can be kind of hard to figure out where to put your hands at all times, and it can be annoying to constantly drop your yarn and pick up the new one. I am a English knitter, a flicker to be specific, which means I typically knit like this. This is how I knit. I just don't let go of the needle. I knit like this. But as I've been knitting color work, I've been throwing my yarn because that's easier to knit a stitch and then drop the yarn and pick up the next color. We talked about making sure you're always carrying your yarn in such a way that it's always either going under the yarn, the main color, or over. You just want to make sure you're consistent. And one way to make sure you're consistent with that is to hold 1 yarn in each hand. So if you're an English knitter or a continental knitter, you would be holding I recommend holding the color you're using least, which is your contrast. You're knitting more stitches in your main color than your contrast in the hand your non-dominant knitting hand. So I'm going to hold the yellow. I'm picking it up from under, oh, that's my tail, from under the gray, making sure it's not going over, it's under, and I'm holding it in my left hand. Because this is, I don't knit continental, so I'm just going to hold it like this. And if you pick 1 hand for each yarn, that's going to really help you with color management, making sure your yarn is always either, like I said, under or over your main color. You just want to be consistent. So it takes practice. I'm really still not very good at it. Sometimes I do go back to the dropping and picking up method. That can be a bit slower, but it can be also, you can also be neater because I'm very loose knitting with my other hand. But it's just something that you have to practice at. And you know, this is a small project. This is a cowl, so it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, you can experiment. You can decide, do I like making sure I have to pull my yarn under the gray, or maybe I like pulling it over the main color. do I want to do it like this? If you're a continental knitter, you can actually, see, I'm not good at this because I'm not a continental knitter. You can actually, you know, hold your yarns together and maybe pick pick it. See, I'm not good at this. I've seen other knitters do this, where they knit, where they can just pick their color and then they can pick the new one. I'm not that kind of knitter. But it's just something you have to play with and experiment with. And at the end of which, you'll get a cowl and you'll learn something about yourself as a knitter and how you do color work. And that's it. That's all there is to do it. Color work is something so fun to do. It's so fun to make patterns with just colors instead of like knit stitches and purl stitches and lace stitches. So it's just something you have to practice at. But that's the first 2 rows. And I will meet you back to where we get to make the end of the cowl. So I have finished all the color work for my cowl, done all the repeats to my pattern, and I just have a few stitches left to work. So I'm gonna work these. And I have finished all the color work in my pattern. I am finished with my contrasting color, so I am now going to take my little snips here and just cut the contrasting color, just leaving about a 6-inch tail, and that's all finished. And I want to give you a bit of a close-up on my here's my beginning of round. You can see we did our little color work. We knit the last stitch of every round as if it were supposed to be knit 1 round above, and that makes our seam quite invisible. We don't have that jog. There are a few spots, if you're really looking closely, you can kind of see, but for the most part, you're not going to be able to tell. Okay, so now I'm going to follow my pattern. I have to knit 1 round plain before I knit the ribbing, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about bind-offs. I finished all the ribbing for the top of my cowl. I've done my top hem and I'm ready to bind off, and in the pattern I tell you to just do a regular bind off, and just bind off how you normally would, you know, your regular knit 2, throw 1 over, bind off. But I'm going to talk about, you have a little bit of an option here. This is my first sample of the Kette Cowl, and as you can see, this is my bind off, and it's a bit looser than my cast on, and the work kind of flares out, and this is an effect I got by doing a loose bind off. That way, like, this would be the bottom of my cowl, so it just would flare a little bit and fit a bit better around the neck. And that's the bind off I'm going to demonstrate to you. Now, you could do a tighter bind off, you could go down a needle size or up a needle size to get the effect you want, but I'm just going to demonstrate how I bind off my cowl. So I'm all ready to bind off, and this is my favorite bind off to do. I knit 2, and then I knit both those stitches through the back loop. I'm splitting my yarn. And now I repeat, knit 1, knit 2 stitches through the back loop. The reason I do this bind off is if I bind off the normal way, like just throwing this over the other stitch, that's too tight for me. I bind off very tightly. So I do it this way because it's still doing this extra knit two together makes it my work a little bit looser, but it's still not super stretchy like a traditional stretchy bind off. Like here's my bind off. There's not a lot of tug, though it does flare out. It itself is not super stretchy. So this is the bind off I prefer. I just get one, and I put my needle back through those two stitches and knit them together. And that's how I'm gonna bind off all my stitches. So I have 2 stitches left to bind off, and I want to show you how I finish off the cowl. So I've bound off all my stitches, and here I am at the beginning of the round. Now you can just cut your yarn and fasten off, but I like to do something to help this little stair step here. I simply take my needle and put it under the first stitch I bound off, and then I pick up a stitch and just bind it off as though it were an actual stitch, and that helps eliminate that stair step. And all I have to do now is cut my yarn and weave in all my ends, and our cowl is complete. And we have the foots on the back here, if you want to see them, from our color work. We've completed our color work cowl.